Lots of new JavaScript developers completely miss out on learning how to work with the DOM, and that's because they're in a bit of a rush to learn a framework like React, Angular, or Vue. And that's certainly one way to approach things, but it's a bit like learning how to use a microwave. Sure, you're going to be able to feed yourself with something relatively tasty, but you're not truly learning how to cook. And in a similar way, learning to work with the DOM with JavaScript is a really important skill, and it's one that you should have in order to become a successful web developer. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can use your existing JavaScript knowledge to work with the DOM by selecting parts of it, making changes, and adding and removing bits to an existing web page. First, let's clear up exactly what the DOM is. So DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it's a way to represent certain types of documents on the web. There are lots of technicalities about the DOM that might be a bit confusing for a beginner. For example, the DOM is a programming interface to the document. It has a tree-like structure with nodes and objects, but what you really need to know about the DOM in JavaScript is that we get a specific object available to us that has loads of different properties and functions that we can use to work with and change the existing web page that we're working with. So what sort of things can we do with the DOM using JavaScript? Well, we can modify elements by changing their styles or updating the text that's inside them. We can remove them completely from the DOM, or we can even create new elements and insert them into any part of the document structure that we want to. So now we have an idea of what the DOM is, let's have a look at some examples of how you can use JavaScript code to work with the current HTML document. Okay, so now we're set up, let's go ahead and look at some examples of how to work with the DOM using JavaScript. So I've prepared a HTML document for us, which is what you can see on the page, and we've got the markup here on the left hand side. Nothing too complicated, just a few p tags with some text. There's a cute picture of a cat, and then we've got this users table that's got some hard-coded user information in there, and as you can see in the markup down here, just some text that's been put into the table rows. And then in the document, there's various different buttons that are dotted around. And what we're going to do later on is wire those buttons up to some events and use it to trigger some functions to update the DOM. But we're going to start off basic just by selecting a few elements and seeing what you can do by changing the structure. And you can run this code that we're going to be doing either directly in the web developer console tab of your browser, or you can put it into a script tag in a file and run that on the page when it loads. And we'll be doing a bit of both throughout the tutorial. We'll be doing some simple stuff in the console, and then as we get a bit more complex, we'll put stuff into the script file so that we can keep functions together and so forth. So let's first of all take a look at what the document object looks like in the console here. And as mentioned in the intro, the document object in JavaScript is essentially our DOM structure. It's our interface to working with the document. And if you just log it out, as we have done here, you can see all of the different components that make up our document, including the body tag, which has got all of the visible elements on there, such as the heading level 1 tag and all of these p tags here. And hovering over them, you can actually see them being highlighted in the page above. So you can actually see which element refers to what part on the page. But it's this document object that we're going to be using, and it provides us with all of the different properties and functions to work with the DOM. So you can see here, if you just scroll down through the available options, we've got loads of different stuff in there, and each of these different properties either represents some information about the DOM or a function that we can call. So the first function we're going to look at is actually to select an element on the page, and it's called the query selector function, and you may have come across this in previous tutorials before, and it enables us to pass a CSS selector to the function, and it returns the first element in the DOM that actually matches that selector. So let's give it a go and see what that looks like. So query selector, and if I wanted to select the heading level 1 tag, for example, that learn JavaScript DOM up there, I could just pass in a h1 selector, and the CSS selector is basically anything that you would use, any rules that you would set up in your CSS file. So it could be a class, or it could be just an element, or it could be something a bit more specific. But if we run that query selector function in the console here, you can see we get the h1 tag back as we'd expect. And again, hovering over it in the console, it highlights the element location on the page. and you can actually open it up and see the inner contents inside there. So this would be the same sort of thing as going into the Elements tab of your browser DevTools, and then just open it up from here. You can see it looks exactly the same. And what we can do as well in the DevTools, in the Elements page, is to make some changes. So we could say, change some of that text, for example. But once we've made those changes, if we do refresh the page, you can see those changes disappear. They're only temporary. We've made a change to the DOM structure here inside of the Elements tab. But when the page is reloaded, everything from the HTML file is reloaded into the browser, and any changes that you've made are lost. And the same sort of thing applies when we make these changes via JavaScript. So how do we actually make a change to the DOM via JavaScript? Well, let's rerun that function again that we had for selecting the H1 element. And to change the text contents that's inside of the H1 tag, we can just access its text content property, and that allows us to reassign a value to the text that's inside of the H1 tag. So for example, we could say hello. So that has actually replaced everything that's inside of the H1 tag. So you can see here in the Elements tag that the span tag that was in there before with the JavaScript inside it, that's been completely removed as well. There's no other HTML elements. We've completely replaced everything inside of that. So it's worth bearing that in mind if you're going to be updating elements in this way. It does actually remove everything from it if you update the text content property. This won't allow you to add your own HTML content inside there. So for example, if you wanted to put the span inside there of class of highlight, that's similar to what we had before. So if you do something like that, you can see that the text content property doesn't allow us to have put our own HTML markup inside there. There is another property that you can access once you've selected an element, which is the inner HTML property, and that will allow you to put HTML inside of the elements. So you can see now we've restored that span tag that was in there before. But there are other better ways of creating elements, which we're going to see a bit later on. That will allow you to have more control over the elements that you're creating. So that's the basics of Query Selector. What about though if you wanted to select the span tag that's inside of that H1 element? Well, we can do a similar sort of thing. We can say document.querySelector, and we're selecting H1, the H1 tag again, but we want to select the span tag that's inside of it. And if you've got a basic understanding of CSS, you know that you can do something like this to say, I want to select the span tag that's inside of the H1 tag itself. So we can run that function and it gives us back the span, and we can do things again with that, like changing the text content if we want to. So maybe we'll say hello world. And this way you can select things anywhere on the page as long as you give it a specific CSS selector. So another way to write this CSS selector would be to select the class of that span tag that's inside of the H1. So we could do that just by providing the highlight class to this query selector function here. So we'll say highlight, let's change it to someone else, and say hello everyone. And so it has the same effect, so you can obviously use whichever CSS selector is most appropriate and maybe the easiest one to give you the most specific result that you're after. But as mentioned, the query selector function only gives you the first element that is found in the document based on that CSS selector. So for example, if this p tag down here had the class of highlight, we would get the highlighted text appearing for us. And if we were to run this query selector again, targeting the highlight class, you'll see only the first element, which is that span tag, actually gets updated, and the p tag is remained unchanged. So that's one very important thing to remember about query selector, is it only affects the first element that it finds matching that CSS selector. But not to worry, there is actually another function that allows us to target all of the elements based on a CSS selector, and that is the query selector all function. But this behaves a little bit differently, and it actually gives us something which looks a little bit like an array for all of the elements that are matched. So here we're getting what is called a node list back with two elements. One is the span and one is the p tag. And it does look a lot like an array, but there are certain array functions that you can't use with it, depending on which browser you're using. But you should be able to call a for each function on this. So this will give us each of the elements in that node list. So we could say for each element, we can do the same sort of thing that we did before, and say the text content is set to highlight. And now when we run this query selector all function, it will go through each of those elements, the span and the p tag, and change the text content for each one. You can actually change a node list into an array, so you can use other JavaScript array functions like map, filter, etc. And you can do this with the array from function. So let's just have a look at the table down here. Let's say we want to use document.querySelectorAll to get all of the table rows. So we'll target the TR in the CSS selector. So you can see it gives us 11 items, but they're in a node list. So if we wanted to do something like filter, there's no filter function available for us there. So if we save this into a variable, we'll just say table rows, for example, and we call the array from function, and then just pass in the result of the query selector, which is that node list. If we look at the table rows variable now, it looks a bit more like an array. It hasn't got that node list prefix to it, and you can call things like filter and map, and it will behave in pretty much the same way as a normal array in JavaScript. So that's the basics of selecting parts of the DOM using JavaScript. There are a couple of other JavaScript selection functions which are probably worth mentioning. One which I use quite regularly is getElementById. And this works slightly different from query selector in that you have to put in a specific ID. For example, we've got something with an ID here. The image tag here has got an ID of catpic, so we'll say catpic. And you can see that returns the image tag that matches that ID. And you can see there are other functions available, such as getElementsByClassName and getElementsByTagName. But query selector is so flexible that you shouldn't really need to use anything else other than those two functions for query selector and query selector all. Okay, so hopefully we're quite comfortable now in being able to select elements from the DOM using those couple of functions there. Let's have a look at a bit more detail about the sort of things that you can change and how you manipulate those elements that are already on the page. So let's select the h1 tag again. So we'll say query selector h1. And from this selector that we've got, we can access pretty much any property that is available to us on the node, including the style property. So the style property is a kind of object that gives us the ability to set different parts of the CSS appearance for this particular element. So for example, I could set the color property, which is obviously the text color, and we could change that. If we assign it a value of red, you can see that updates the text color for the h1 up to red. So you can pretty much access any type of CSS property in this way and use it to kind of modify the style and the appearance of that element. The only thing to be aware of with this is things that in CSS that have hyphens. So let's see if we've got an example in the style sheet here. So things like background color, for example, are hyphenated, and because JavaScript doesn't really like hyphens in variable names and property names, we have to camel case the background color property. So that'd look a little bit like this. So background color, and let's just use that dark cyan color there. So you can see if you want to change any CSS style property that has a hyphen in it, you need to remove the hyphen and then uppercase the second word, which is in other words camel case. And of course you can use the shorthand properties that you find in CSS. So as an example, if we wanted to change things like padding of this element, we can assign it a new value and then just say 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 40 pixels. It's a bit random, but there we go. And you can see that that shorthand property, as long as we provide it as one continuous string, it will update that element in pretty much the same way that you would find if you were applying this in your style sheet. So as promised earlier on, we said we were going to assign some of these changes to the buttons that we've got on the page so that when you click them, it makes those changes automatically for us and we don't need to run them in the console. So what we're going to do is we're going to target this button, again using our DOM query selectors, and then set up an event listener on it, which will run some further query selectors to change some elements. So the ID that we've got here of the button at the top here is update header. So let's just copy that. And I'm going to say the update header button element is equal to, and I'll start off just by using a query selector. and it's got an ID of update header, so we just put the hash before the name of the ID, and then when the page loads, this variable here should contain a reference to that button. So then what we can do with that button is just say add event listener, and the event listener we're going to listen for is click. Oops. And we're going to run a function, and basically inside of that function we can just run a few more query selectors to update some styles on the page. So let's set the H1 style color to be red, and let's also set the H1 style background color to be that dark cyan. Okay, so the page is reloaded, it's refreshed, but now if we click the update header button, what we should find is that event listener is fired, and the different styles for the heading level 1 tag are updated as we've set out in that function. So it's all very well setting up styles in this way, but it might be a bit laborious if you want to change the look and feel of an element with each individual CSS property. You might be better off just doing this with CSS classes, but luckily the JavaScript DOM gives us the ability to work with classes of an element, and it gives us the ability to add or remove different classes once we've selected something via a query selector. So in our style sheet, I've got a couple of classes set up. We've got the hidden class, for example, and we've got the highlight class. So one thing we could do is just apply one of these classes to an element once we've selected it. So let's have a look at some examples of how to do that. So again, we're going to use the query selector. So we'll say query selector, heading level 1. And then we're going to access the class list property that's available to us. And this has a few different functions available. We can check for different classes on there, we can add them, and we can remove them. But in this example, we're just going to add the hidden class. So this is the class that's defined in my style sheet on the left there. This won't work if you don't have the class defined already and available on the page. But you can see when I run that line of code, the hidden class should now have been added to the H1 tag. You can see it there. And it has obviously run the CSS rule, which is to say display is none, and it's removed the header, or removed the visibility of the header from the page. So let's copy that particular line here and put it into our script tag. So we won't worry about the styles because we're just going to hide things here. So now what we should find when the page reloads is that the hidden class has been removed from the H1 tag, but now clicking the button, we should reapply that and it disappears. So you can have great fun with that by putting that onto buttons and making various different parts of your web pages disappear and really annoy your users. But it's just to demonstrate that you can add classes to an element and have multiple styles applied to it in one go, and not have to worry about updating each style property individually. So some HTML elements are a bit more complex than the ones we've been looking at, and they might have additional attributes that describe what the element does or give it some particular action. So a good example of that is the anchor tag that we've got here. So although it's got a bit of text in there, it has also got a URL that obviously when you click it takes you to that particular place. So that's something that you can also work with in your JavaScript code when working with the DOM. You can access the attributes of a particular element and then change them if you need to. So let's take a look at that anchor tag as an example. So to get an attribute such as its href, we first want to select the element. So we'll say query selector and just select the anchor tag. It's the only anchor tag on the page, so it should just find that first one that we've got there, which it does. And what you can do in this example as well is just access the href property of it, and it should give us the URL exactly of where we've specified to go to. So that doesn't work with all attributes. Sometimes you need to use a generic function to just get an attribute from an element. So the function name that is available to us, unsurprisingly, is called getAttribute. But you see, if we pass that the string of href, so just to be aware that some attributes might not be available in the same way as href, but you can use the getAttribute function to actually find out any attribute that's on the element. So once we've targeted the href, we should be able to reassign a value to it. So let's just say we'll point it to localhost. And now if we select that element again, you should see that the href has now been updated in the structure of the page. And if we look in the Elements tab and just locate that anchor tag, which is in the second P here, I believe, you can see it's also changed in the page. And I'm not going to click it because there's nothing there, but it would take us to that address that we've just specified. And you saw how to use the get attribute function a moment ago. And of course, there is a corresponding set attribute as well. Function which you can call, and you can then pass that in a value as well. So we'll say twitter.com. I think that's still the address of it. So if you prefer to use a set attribute function like that just to be safe, then you can do that as well. So let's take a look at another example of setting and getting attributes, and we're going to do that with the image tag that we've got here with the cat. So we've got cat1 is the JPEG that's being loaded. So let's just target that image. I'm going to target it by its ID because there are other images on the page, so we don't want to get confused as to which one we're targeting. So this time I'll use get element by ID. I'll say cat pic, which has given us the image. And again, let's look at its source property, which is telling that image tag which particular image to load. So let's just reassign that. So it should be good enough here in my environment to say image and then cat2.jpg. So if we set that source property, you can see a different image is loaded, and we've actually changed the attribute for that image tag and indeed the structure of the page again. And so that's just another example of how you can access elements on the page and change the various attributes that they have. And of course, when we reload the page, everything's back to normal, and we've got the original image and the original link in our anchor tag. So again, those changes aren't permanent. We're just making those changes to the document structure, and then when the page reloads, we're loading up the document from the HTML file again. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is how to actually remove elements from the DOM. And this is just a case of first selecting an element and then calling a function, which is remove, and it will take that element out of the structure. So let's have a look at our old friend, the h1 tag again. So we'll say query selector and just the h1. Let's just check that we've got it. So yeah, we've got the h1 tag. And if we want to remove it, there's just a function called remove from here. And this time it's not disappeared, it's not hidden as we did when we added the class before. It's actually been totally removed from the HTML structure or the DOM, and it's no longer available. So I think if we try and do a query selector again, it should come back with nothing because there's nothing there. So there's no undo button and there's no confirmation. So once you've removed that element, you can't get it back unless you reload the page or recreate it. So just something to be careful of when you're removing elements like this. So that moves us on to looking at our table again. So there are certain things in here. We want to remove a row when we click this button. And there's also a button down here to remove all of the rows. So we'll look at the remove all first because that one's fairly straightforward. And we'll wire this up again to an event listener. So let's just have a look at the ID for this particular button. So it's called remove rows. So what we're going to do in our JavaScript file is say remove rows button element, and that is, we're going to use a query selector again here, although we could use get element by ID as well. So let's use that as a different example. And once we've selected the element, we're going to set up an event listener. So we'll say add event listener, and of course it's a click event. And when that runs, what we're going to do is, first of all, we want to target all of the table row elements. So we did that earlier on. So we'll say table rows is equal to document.query selector, selector all. And we want to target those table row elements, and that will give us that node list. We don't necessarily need to turn it into an array, although we could do. But what we should find is we can call the for each function for each of the rows. I'll just say row. And as we did here a moment ago, we could just call the remove function on that node that we've got in here, and that should be enough to just remove it from the document. So let's save that, and let's close down the DevTools for the moment because we don't need that. But when we click the remove all button, it should trigger this function, select all of the TRs, and actually remove them all. which you can see it does. We've now got an empty table. One thing you might have noticed as well, though, that it does actually remove the table header as well, because that's just a TR at the end of the day inside of the table. Let's just find it here. You can see here in the table head that we've got the TR for the heading. So if we don't want to remove that, which we probably don't, if we just want to remove the data rows, we can target everything inside of the T body. So you can see here we've got the tag or an ID. So back in the script, probably the easiest thing to do in the query selector all is to, with the ID of table data, only select the TRs that are inside of that T body tag with the ID of table data. So let's just run that again. So you can see when that runs now, we've preserved the table header because we're only selecting the TRs that are inside of the body tag with the ID of table data. So let's reload the page and have a look at how we can actually work with these remove buttons to remove a particular row. And this is a little bit trickier, but still fairly straightforward. Let's go back to the console just for a second and just target one of these buttons. So hopefully you're getting the hang of the query selectors now. But let's get the first row element. So we'll say the first TR that has a button in it inside it. So that should give us the button in the first row. There is also the remove row class, so we could use that as a query selector too. And what we want to do is actually remove the overall row. So calling the remove on this query selector won't do as much good because it will just remove the button. So do that, for example. We don't want to do that. We want to remove the entire row. So the DOM actually provides us with lots of different ways of traversing through the structure of it, and we're going to look at that just to wrap up towards the end of the video. But just to give you an example, there are different things that we can access on the element, such as the parent properties. So we can say the parent element, which you can see is the TD, which is the cell that's containing that button. But we could also call the parent element on top of that as well. So we could say parent element. And now you can see that gives us the TR for the first row in the table. So we could do that and then say remove. Oops, if I actually call a function. And you can see that first row from the table has now been deleted. So you can see we can use the different properties that are available on the elements to navigate through the structure of the DOM. Because as we said at the start, it's kind of like a tree. It's like got a hierarchical structure, so you can move up and down and left and right in it and so forth. So how do we apply this to that button? So it's just a case of setting up an event listener, but this time we're going to find all of the buttons on the page for the table at least, and set up an event listener. So when it's clicked, we remove the parent element, which is the TR. So first of all, let's select all of the buttons in the table. So as mentioned, they do have a class of remove row. So we'll use that to select them and target them all. So we'll say document.remove button elements is equal to document.querySelector all. And then it's the class of remove row. And then for each of those remove button elements, so we'll call the for each function. So for each of those elements, what we're going to do is we're going to set up an event listener first of all. So we'll say element.add event listener. And of course it's a click event one more time. And when that click event occurs, what we're going to do is similar to what we did in the console a moment ago. We're going to say parent element dot remove. So element will be the button, parent element will be the TD, the cell, and then parent element will be the row, and we just want to remove it. So this will loop through and set up the event listener for each of those buttons, and when it's clicked, it goes to the parent element, and then removes it, which should be the row. Let's close down the console for a moment, and let's just pick a random one. So Sophia, let's see if we can get rid of her. If we click remove, she disappears. Massit, remove him. And you can see we can just keep going and remove each one. So hopefully you've got the idea now of how to remove things from the DOM. Let's take a look at how you can add things to the DOM by creating new elements and putting them wherever you want to. So you saw at the start of the tutorial how to use the text content property to set the text inside of an element to something, but it removes any HTML markup that's inside of there. But we also saw about how to use the inner HTML property, which does preserve any HTML markup that you put inside. And that's certainly one way to actually create new HTML elements on the page. It does have a bit of a disadvantage, which you'll see in just a moment, but let's just have a quick refresher of how to do that. So let's just query select the heading level 1 tag again, and just set its inner HTML to be some text, and then we'll just use an emphasis tag for world. So that should just give us some italics there for the world. So that has created a new HTML tag, an EM tag, and inserted that into the H1 element. But we don't have any control over that new element that we've created. We'd need to use a query selector to actually select it again if we wanted to make any further changes. So I'm going to show you a more flexible approach which allows you to create an element programmatically using JavaScript and then insert that somewhere into the document structure. So the function that you need to call in order to create a new element is document.createElement. And we need to store this in a variable so that we can use it later on, because otherwise it's just kind of lost. So let's just say new element is equal to document.createElement. So this createElement function takes one argument, which is a string, and the string that you give it basically is the name of the tag that you want to create. So for example, if we wanted to create a new paragraph tag and put some text inside it, we would use P because it's just the name of the tag. And then this new element, if we just log it out to the console, you can see is just an empty P tag. So once we've created a new element, we will probably want to put some content inside it as well. So there are various different ways that you can do that, but that new element variable is essentially the same as the result of what we get once we've done a query selector. So we can simply say new element.text content is equal to, and then just say some text, for example. So let's have a look at new element again. So now it's got that text inside of it as we've set with the text content property, but you'll probably notice that it's not appearing anywhere on the page. That's because we've created the element, but we need to actually put it somewhere into the document structure. So we need to call another function on the document to actually get this element onto the page, but we need to decide where we're going to put the element. So let's go over to our HTML page and just see where we could put it. And let's just say we want to put it at the bottom of the page just before these buttons finish. So we want to basically select the body element, the body tag in our document, and then insert it just at the bottom of that. So one thing we could do is use a query selector. Let's just clear this down actually. So we'll say document.querySelector, and then we'll target the body tag. And then we want to call a function on this to add that new element in there. So we'll say append child, and then we'll pass in the variable that contains our new P tag, which is new element. So if we do that and then scroll to the bottom of the page, you should find that that P tag is there, and it's got the text in there obviously. And looking inside of the Elements tab of our browser tools, you can see that tag is appearing just right at the bottom of the body. It's probably worth noting as well that on the document object, you've actually got access to the body tag directly as a property. So you don't necessarily need to do query selector body. You could just say document.body.appendChild. They do exactly the same thing. So the advantage of doing things this way by creating elements programmatically is we've still got a reference here to the new element that was created. So if we want to make some changes to it, such as changing the text, we can just access its text content property and then say, let's say hello world again. And you can see that automatically updates on the page. So if you are working with lots of different newly created elements on the page and you want to keep track of them and change their properties or the text that's inside them in this example, then it's worth doing this way because it gives you all of the elements in JavaScript code that you can then update later on. So this is great for content that changes quite frequently. So let's take another example and we'll create an image tag. And the same sort of principle applies here. We'll say new image is equal to document.create create element. This time we're going to pass it the string of img for the image tag. But with image tags, we want to make sure that it's got the right source property in there so that it actually points to something. Because if we were just to say document.body .append child new image, the image should be there, but we need to tell it which image it should load. So as we saw earlier on, we can access the source property, and then we can just say image, and we load up cat2.jpg. Whoops, I typed in image instead of new image there. So image source is equal to image cat2.jpg. And you should see now that that's appearing at the bottom of our page. So using this method as well, you can set any properties that you like or any attributes that you like on the elements. So for example, the ID can be set here as well. So we can say catpig2. And then we can also access the class list as well. So for example, we could say class list.add and add a class from here too as well. So you really have fine-grained control over how that image is created. And as mentioned, it keeps that reference to all of those elements so that you can access them later on as well. So there are a couple of other functions which are really handy for adding in elements into your page, and that is the insert adjacent text and HTML functions. And as the name suggests, adjacent, they can be added in next to other items, either above, before, or inside them as well. So let's have a quick look at how that works. So we've got at the top of the page some p tags. So I'm just going to select the first one using a query selector. Oops. So we'll say document.querySelector p. And you can see that gives us that first p tag at the top of the page there that's been highlighted. So from that query selector, once we've selected the element, we can actually call one of these insert functions here. So we've got various different ones. The two we're going to focus on here are text and HTML. So text, as the name suggests, will just allow us to add a text node into the document structure. And where we add it is specified by this first argument. But let's just set up some data first of all. Some inserted text. So this first argument is one of 4 options. It's before begin, after begin, before end, or after end. And each one will put it in a different location. So if we wanted to put it before the p tag occurs, we'll say before begin. And you can see that's actually outside of the p tag now. If it was inside, it would be highlighted. We can just check that that's there. Or if we wanted to do something after the p tag, we could say after end. So this will be after the p tag has been closed. You can see now it's outside of that p tag. And then we've got after begin, which obviously will put it inside of the p tag. So we should see some highlighted text inside of that yellow box. And if we just check inside of our elements page as well, you can see that's just been inserted just inside here before the main text that was already there. And then the final one is before end, which will just put it before the tag is actually closed. Let's just have a look at that here. So you can see now we've got one final text node that's been inserted with some inserted text. That's really great if you want to have some fine-grained control as to where you're putting that text on the page, and you don't want to worry about traversing the document structure as we did when we were removing the rows from the table earlier on. And you've got the equivalent functions with insert adjacent HTML as well. Let's just refresh the page to clear all those other ones out. And the function works exactly the same, except the string that we've got here now can actually contain some HTML as well. So for example, we might want to put a span tag around the text that we're inserting. So you can see there that text is there. And if we have a look at that first p tag in the elements tab, you can see the span tag has been preserved because that insert adjacent HTML function preserves any HTML that we have inside of the string that we're actually appending into the document. Okay, so we're going to wrap up this tutorial by looking at a few ways that you can traverse the DOM, and we saw one earlier on when we were looking at removing the rows from the table, but just to go through a few things that you can use to navigate through the structure when you're in your JavaScript code. So the first thing to note is that in the document object there is a children property in here. So you can see here our document has just got the one child, which is the HTML tag, which makes sense because if you look at the document, it is the top of our structure of our document. We've also got things like document body, as we saw earlier on, and we can access the children property of that, which is a bit more useful for a JavaScript developer because then that gives us every element that's on the page and we can navigate through that as well, simply by looping through each element if we want to, or even accessing an item at a specific position if we want to. So there are also some convenience properties and functions that you can use to access and traverse different parts of the DOM. For example, on the document body, you may be able to access the first child property, which should give you the first element that's within the body tag. Now, you'd expect that to be the H1 tag, but it won't be that in this example. There are actually some text nodes that are represented by the white space. So we'll find that we've got that here. And you can see there's a new line followed by some spaces here. So if we actually just modify the structure of the page a little bit here by moving the H1 tag directly to be the first child after the body, and then rerun that again, you'll see that does give us the H1 tag. So maybe not the most useful, but if you do need to know what exactly is the first child after a specific element, then you can use that first child property. And in a similar way, there's also the last child property as well, which does the same thing, but at the other end of the tag before it closes. Of course, you can chain these and combine them as we did in our example earlier on. So for example, we could say first child for our document body, and that gives us the text node that's inside of there, which is learn. And then it works the other way as well, which is to go back up. So we could say the document body dot parent element, which, because the body is inside of the HTML tag, should give us the overall HTML structure for the document itself, which is pretty much the same as document in this example. So we know how to go up and down in the document structure by using children or parent elements, but what about if we want to go side to side? Well, let's just access that first child property again, which will be the H1 tag. So we can use siblings, which will be at the same level as the element that's been selected, but we can go left or right in that structure by using the sibling properties. So we can use next element sibling, which will get us the next sibling, which is an element and not a text node. And in this case, it's the div, which is just here. Or we can use previous. So let's do another query selector for one of the P tags. So query selector P, and let's just say previous element sibling. So now we're sort of over here in the document structure. So the previous one is basically the div element again, so it should be exactly the same element. And as we saw when we were removing the elements from the table, you can chain those as well. So you can go parent, sibling, child, whichever you like, and use those different properties to navigate up and down and left and right throughout the document structure. So of course, learning about all these different things is great, and hopefully you've had a little go in your console dev tools and had a little code along as well. But there's nothing like doing some solid practice and working through some examples and some exercises. So you should definitely check out this next video where we go through lots of different DOM exercises, and you can really brush up on your skills of selecting elements and modifying things on the current page.